What if the word Jesus cried out in his darkest hour has been mistranslated for generations? What if Abba was never baby talk, never a toddler's whimper for daddy, but the most terrifying, most courageous word a grown man could ever speak to his father? Tonight, that lie ends. Daniel Carter closed his laptop harder than he meant to. The sound cracked through the empty office, and for a moment, he just sat there staring at the blank screen like it had personally betrayed him. 3 words. That's all he'd written for Sunday's sermon in the last 2 hours. God is your daddy. He'd typed it, deleted it, typed it again. And now at 11:40 at night, with the church heater ticking somewhere behind the walls and his coffee gone cold beside him, he deleted it one final time and just stopped. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his chest before he could name it in his mind. He'd preached this line 100 times. He'd said it at funerals to comfort grieving widows. He'd said it to teenagers who thought God was too far away to care. He'd said it so many times, it had stopped sounding like a discovery and started sounding like a habit, a little spiritual candy he handed out because it was sweet and it was easy and nobody ever pushed back. But tonight, he was supposed to preach on Gethsemane, on the night before the cross, on the moment Jesus' sweating drops that Scripture says looked like blood fell to the ground and cried out to his Father. And suddenly, Daddy didn't fit. Daniel opened his Bible to Mark chapter 14 and read the verse out loud slowly, like he was hearing it for the first time. Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. He stopped, read it again. That's not a child's prayer, he whispered to the empty room. That's not a child's prayer at all. He sat back in his chair, and for the first time in 15 years of ministry, Daniel Carter admitted something to himself that scared him more than any theological debate ever had. He didn't actually know what Abba meant. He'd just assumed. Everyone had just assumed. And assumptions he was about to learn can survive inside a church for generations without a single person ever checking if they're true. Joy. The next morning, Daniel brought it up at the men's Bible study, half joking, half serious, the way pastors do when they're testing an idea before they commit to it out loud. What if I told you Abba doesn't actually mean daddy? Frank Whitmore, 71 years old, deacon for 2 decades, the kind of man who'd heard every sermon trick in the book, set his coffee down slowly. Now hold on, Pastor, Frank said, leaning forward. I've heard that explained from this pulpit for 30 years. My own father taught me that. You telling me my father was wrong? The room went quiet. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. This was the moment. He could back off, laugh it off, say, just thinking out loud, and move on to announcements. That would be the safe thing. He didn't. I'm telling you, Daniel said carefully, that I looked at the actual verse last night, and I don't think a grown man on his knees terrified of dying was using baby talk. I think we've been shrinking something that was never meant to be small. Frank's jaw tightened. Shrinking it how? I don't know yet, Daniel admitted. That's the problem. I don't know yet. And that admission, I don't know yet, sat in the room like a dropped stone rippling outward, because a pastor who doesn't know yet is either about to fail in front of his congregation or about to find something that changes everything. He went home that night and didn't sleep. His wife Rachel found him at 1 a.m., hunched over the kitchen table, 3 books open, a legal pad covered in his cramped handwriting. Daniel. She said his name like a question and a warning at the same time. It's 1 in the morning. I know. You have church in 9 hours. I know, Rachel, I know, He rubbed his eyes. I think I've been teaching something wrong for years, and I don't know how to stand up Sunday and just keep saying it if it's not true. Rachel pulled out a chair and sat across from him, and for a second, neither of them said anything. What did you find? She finally asked. Daniel slid the legal pad toward her. On it, he'd written a single Aramaic word transliterated in blocky letters, Abba. It's not a baby word, he said. I always thought it was like Dada, the first sound a toddler makes. That's what I was told in seminary. That's what half the commentaries online will tell you. But Rachel, His voice dropped like he was afraid of the words even as he said them. I found records of grown men, respected rabbis, using this exact word for their fathers, full-grown adults, not toddlers. Rachel's eyebrows lifted. Grown men called their fathers Abba. Yes, so it's just a regular word for father. That's what I thought too at first, Daniel said. But it's not that simple either. It's not the formal word. It's not the distant, respectful word you'd use in a courtroom or in official writing. It sits somewhere else entirely. It's warmer than that. Closer than that. Then what is it? Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time that night, something like wonder broke through the exhaustion on his face. I think, he said slowly, it's a word that never stopped being intimate but never stopped being respectful either. I think we tore those two things apart, and the word was never built to be torn. Rachel sat back. So when Jesus said it in the garden, he wasn't asking his daddy to make the pain go away like a scared little kid, Daniel said. He was a grown man hours from the most brutal death imaginable, bringing his absolute terror to his father, and still trusting him enough to add, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." Rachel, that's not weakness. That's the strongest prayer I've ever read in my life. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Then Rachel said something that would not leave Daniel's mind for the rest of the week. If that's true, she said quietly, then you haven't just been simplifying a word, Daniel. You've been letting people believe something small when God was actually offering them something enormous. Sunday came faster than Daniel wanted it to. He stood behind the pulpit, looked out over 300 faces. People who trusted him. People who had buried spouses and buried children and needed to believe God was close enough to hear them, and he almost reached for the old easy version. God is your daddy would have gotten a few warm nods. It always did. Instead, he opened his Bible. I need to tell you something I got wrong, Daniel said, and the room went still in that particular way. Rooms go still when people sense a pastor is about to say something real. For years I told you Abba means daddy. I told you Jesus was using baby talk in the garden. I was wrong. And what I found instead this week at my kitchen table at 1 a.m, I think it might change how every single one of you prays. Frank Whitmore, sitting in the third pew, folded his arms. Rachel, sitting near the back, held her breath. And Daniel Carter, for the first time in his ministry, stepped into a sermon with no idea how the congregation would respond, only certain that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was worth more than the comfortable lie he'd been handing out for 15 years. Turn with me, he said, to the Garden of Gethsemane. I want to show you the night everything about this word changed, and why the real meaning of Abba isn't softer than what you were taught. He paused, letting the silence stretch. It's heavier, and it's about to break your heart open in the best possible way. Daniel let the Bible fall open in his hands, the pages worn soft from years of turning to the same passages. Turn with me to Mark chapter 14, he said, verse 36. I want you to hear this the way I heard it Tuesday night alone at my kitchen table, when I finally stopped assuming and started asking. He read slowly. Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. He closed the book halfway, his finger still marking the page. For 15 years I told you that word Abba was baby talk. I told you it was the first syllable a toddler babbles before they can even form real sentences. Something like dada, cute, small, safe. He shook his head. I was wrong. And I need you to understand exactly how wrong, because the truth isn't smaller than what I taught you. It's bigger, much bigger. From the third pew, Frank Whitmore shifted in his seat, arms still crossed. Go on then, Pastor, he said loud enough for the front rows to hear. Convince me. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the sanctuary. Daniel almost smiled. I will, he said. Give me 5 minutes, Frank. Just 5. He stepped down from behind the pulpit, something he almost never did, and walked closer to the congregation, like he needed to close the physical distance, to close the theological one. Aramaic was the language Jesus actually spoke, Daniel said. Not the language of the New Testament manuscripts, that's Greek, but the language of his home, his street, his dinner table. And when the gospel writers hit this one word in the garden, they didn't translate it. They left it exactly as Jesus said it. Abba. Then they added the Greek word right beside it, Father, like they were terrified of losing something in translation. He paused. So I went looking for how that word was actually used, not by children, by everyone. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The room leaned in. Even Frank uncrossed his arms. I found records, rabbinic writings, historical texts showing grown men, respected scholars, calling their elderly fathers Abba. Not 5-year-olds, grown men. 60 years old addressing fathers who were 80, using the exact same word. A woman in the 4th row, Doris Kellerman, 83 years old, a widow who hadn't missed a Sunday in 11 years, raised her hand halfway, then just spoke without waiting to be called on. Then it's just the regular word for father, she said. That's all. Why does that change anything? That's what I thought too, Doris, Daniel said. For about an hour. Then I found something that stopped me cold. He let the silence sit there just long enough to hurt. There was a formal word for father, a distant official word. Legal documents used it. Courtroom testimony used it. If you wanted to speak about your father with proper respectful distance, that's the word you'd reach for. And Jesus didn't use that word, Daniel said. He used Abba instead. On purpose. In the worst moment of his entire life. Doris sat back slowly like the floor had shifted an inch beneath her chair. So it's not distant, she said quietly. But it's not childish either. It's neither, Daniel said. And that's the part that took me 3 days to actually understand. Abba sits in a place English doesn't really have a word for. It's the word of a son who trusts his father enough to be completely honest with him and respects him enough to still call him father. Intimacy and authority, both at once, never one without the other. He walked back toward the pulpit, but didn't climb the steps yet. Now hold that thought, he said, and come with me into the garden. Because that's where this stops being a vocabulary lesson and starts being the realest prayer you'll ever hear. His voice dropped. The lights in the sanctuary seemed dimmer, though nothing had changed. It's the night before the crucifixion. Jesus knows exactly what's coming, not vaguely, not abstractly. He knows the whip, the nails, the suffocation, the shame, all of it in detail hours away. And Scripture tells us he's in so much anguish that his sweat falls like drops of blood. Someone in the back pew shifted audibly. He takes his 3 closest friends into the garden with him. He tells them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Then he goes a little further, alone, and he falls, not kneels, falls to the ground. Daniel's own voice cracked slightly, and he didn't try to hide it. And in that posture on the ground, sweating blood hours from the cross, that is the exact moment he chooses this word, Abba, if it meant daddy. Daniel said, if it really was just a scared child's whimper, that would almost be a strange moment to use it. A grown man facing execution doesn't usually cry out like a toddler asking to be picked up. But if Abba means what I now believe it means, he continued, then this is the only moment in the entire Bible where it could have been used with full weight. Because Jesus is doing 2 things at exactly the same time, and I need you to feel how impossible that actually is. He held up one finger. He's completely honest about his fear. He says flat out, remove this cup from me. No spiritual performance, no pretending he's fine. He tells his father the truth, I don't want this. He held up a second finger, and in the very same breath he surrenders completely. Yet not what I will, but what you will. No bargaining, no conditions, total trust. Daniel looked out over the congregation, and his eyes landed without planning it on Doris. Church, I have prayed my whole life thinking I had to choose. Either I'm honest with God about how scared or angry or broken I am, or I'm faithful, and I just submit and smile through it. I thought those were opposite ends of a rope, and I had to pick a side. Jesus stood in the middle of that rope and held both ends at once. And the word that let him do it, the word that made room for both raw honesty and total trust in the same sentence, was Abba. Frank Whitmore was no longer sitting with his arms crossed. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "Frank," Daniel said gently, "I know your father taught you daddy. Mine did too. I'm not saying he lied to you. I'm saying he was trying to hand you something enormous, using a word too small to carry it. And I think deep down, some part of you already knows that, because when your wife was in the hospital 2 years ago, I remember what you prayed at her bedside. You didn't whisper, 'Daddy, please.' You said, 'Father, I don't understand this, and I trust you anyway.' That's Abba, Frank. You've been praying it correctly your whole life. You just didn't have the word for it." The sanctuary went completely silent. Frank didn't answer. He just nodded once slowly and looked down at his hands. Doris was crying quietly in the 4th row, and she didn't reach to wipe it away. Daniel felt his own throat tighten, and he pushed through it because he wasn't finished, not even close. "Here's what should terrify you and comfort you at exactly the same time," Daniel said. "If this is true, if Abba really carries both closeness and honor, both raw honesty and total trust, then Jesus wasn't just praying a private prayer that night. He was demonstrating something. He was showing us the only kind of prayer that actually survives real suffering. And Paul the Apostle, who once dragged Christians to prison, the man least entitled to closeness with God, later wrote that ordinary believers, people with no special status at all, get to use this exact same word. Not a distant courtroom word, not a toddler's whimper, the same word Jesus used on his knees before the cross. Daniel gripped the edge of the pulpit, which means somewhere between that garden and this sanctuary, something happened that changed who's allowed to say that word out loud. And when I found out what that something was, he stopped himself just for a beat and looked out at 300 faces waiting on the edge of their seats. I had to sit back down at my kitchen table and read it 3 times before I believed it. Daniel climbed back up behind the pulpit, opened his Bible to a different page, and set it down carefully, like it might break. Romans chapter 8, he said. Verse 15. Paul writes this, and I want you to listen to the exact wording, because it's not poetry, it's a legal claim. He read, "You did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, and by him we cry, Abba, Father." He looked up. Adoption. Paul didn't say the spirit of comfort. He didn't say the spirit of closeness. He said adoption. And once I saw that word, I couldn't unsee it, because it sent me somewhere I did not expect to go. He paused, letting his hand rest flat on the page. Roman law, not Jewish custom Roman law. In the 1st century, when a Roman citizen legally adopted a son, there was a ceremony. Witnesses, a magistrate. And, at a specific moment in that ceremony, the newly adopted son was asked to speak, publicly, in front of everyone who had once known him as an outsider. And the word he was required to say, Daniel said, the first legal word out of his mouth, declaring in front of the entire community that he now belonged to this family with full inheritance rights, was Abba. A murmur moved through the sanctuary, not confusion this time, but recognition, the kind of sound a room makes when something clicks into place all at once. Paul knew Roman law, Daniel said. He was a Roman citizen himself. He wasn't reaching for a warm, fuzzy metaphor. He was telling former slaves, former outsiders, former nobodies, you have just been through that ceremony, spiritually, legally. And the word you now get to say out loud in front of everyone who used to look down on you is Abba. He stepped down from the pulpit again, which means this was never just about tone. It was never about whether the word sounds cute. It's about status. It's about who gets to walk into the room and call the Father of the universe by that word, and Paul is saying, point blank, it's not just Jesus anymore. In the back row, a young man in a gray jacket sat very still, arms folded tight across his chest, eyes fixed on the floor. His mother, Carol Jennings, sat beside him, and she reached over just slightly and touched his sleeve. Daniel noticed. He'd noticed the young man the moment he walked in 20 minutes late, hood up, sliding into the last pew like he was trying not to be seen. Marcus, Daniel said, and the young man's head snapped up like he'd been caught doing something wrong. The whole church turned to look. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't do that, Pastor." "I'm not going to embarrass you," Daniel said, and his voice was gentle now. No longer the voice of a sermon, but the voice of a man talking to one person. "I just want to ask you something, and you can answer or not answer. Your call." Marcus didn't say anything. His mother's hand was still on his sleeve. 3 years, Daniel said. "That's how long it's been since you walked through those doors. Your mom told me some of what happened in between. Not all of it. Just some. Enough for me to know you didn't come back here today because things have been easy." Marcus's eyes were wet, and he was fighting it, jaw clenched hard. "I came because she asked me to." Marcus said, his voice low, almost angry. "That's it. I don't belong up here listening to this. Adopted sons. Legal rights. That's not me. I burned that bridge a long time ago." "That's exactly the lie I need to tear down before you leave this building today," Daniel said, and something shifted in his voice, sharper now, urgent. "Because that lie is the reason half this room is sitting there thinking this sermon is for everybody else." He walked halfway down the center aisle, close enough now that Marcus had to look up at him. "You think Abba is a word for people who've earned it," Daniel said. "For people with clean records. For people who never left." But Marcus listened to me. The entire reason Paul had to explain the adoption ceremony is because none of us earned it. Not one person in this building. We were all outside the family. All of us were the ones who'd burned it down. Marcus shook his head, blinking fast now. "You don't know what I've done." "You're right," Daniel said. "I don't. But I know what the ceremony required. It didn't require the son to prove himself worthy before the adoption happened. The adoption happened first. Then the son stood up in front of the same people who remembered exactly who he used to be, and he was given a new word to say. Not because he'd fixed himself, because someone else had already paid for the entire ceremony on his behalf. The sanctuary was silent, except for someone somewhere near the front crying softly. "That someone," Daniel said, turning back toward the whole congregation, now raising his voice again, "is the same Jesus who knelt in that garden and said Abba first. Before any of us said it, before we deserved to say it, before we even knew the word existed." He looked back at Marcus. "He said it in the garden so that you could say it in the back pew. That's the trade, Marcus. That's the whole trade. His honesty and his trust freely given in exchange for your seat at the table, not because you cleaned up first, but because he already paid the entrance fee in blood." Marcus put his face in his hands. His mother wrapped her arm fully around him now, and nobody in the congregation moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody reached for a phone. 300 people sat frozen in that particular silence that only happens when a room realizes it's witnessing something real. Daniel let it breathe. He didn't rush it. He'd learned over 15 years that some moments in a sermon are not his to control. Finally, Marcus lifted his head, wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand, and said so quietly that only the people near him could hear it. "So I could say it, right now, and it wouldn't be a lie. It would be the truest thing you've said in 3 years, Daniel said. Marcus didn't say it out loud. Not yet. But his lips moved just barely, and Carol Jennings closed her eyes and pressed her hand against her mouth. Daniel walked back toward the pulpit, his own eyes stinging now, and he had to stop for a second before he could keep talking. "Here is the part I need every single person in this room to hear," he said, his voice thick. "This is not a word for the people who have it together. It was never that word. It is specifically, deliberately a word built for people who don't. Because if closeness to God required you to earn it first, none of us would ever get to say it. Not Marcus, not Frank, not Doris, not me standing up here in a suit pretending I've got this all figured out." He looked out at all of them. "The invitation was never based on how long you've been gone. It was never based on how bad the thing was that you did. It was based entirely on whether someone else already paid the price to bring you back into the room. And he did," Daniel said. 2,000 years ago, on his knees, sweating blood, he already did. He stopped breathing hard, and for a moment the church was so quiet, you could hear the old building settling around them. "So now the only question left," Daniel said, "the only question that actually matters after everything we've just uncovered is, what do you do with a word this expensive once it's finally sitting in your own mouth?" Marcus sat there for a long moment, his mother's arms still around him, the whole sanctuary holding its breath without meaning to. Then he stood up. Nobody told him to. Nobody expected it. Carol grabbed for his hand, half to stop him, half just to stay connected to him, and he let her hold it. But he stood there in the back pew in front of 300 people who all knew exactly who he used to be, and his voice cracked wide open when he finally said it. "Abba." Just that. One word. Barely above a whisper, but the room was so quiet, it carried to every corner. "Father," Marcus said louder now, and his whole body was shaking. I don't know how to do this right. I don't know if I even believe it yet, but I'm done pretending I don't want it." Carol was sobbing openly now, no longer trying to hide it, and she pulled him down into a hug that nearly knocked them both into the pew in front of them. Daniel stood frozen at the front of the church, and he let himself feel it too. Didn't fight, it didn't clear his throat, and move on like pastors are trained to do. He just stood there and watched a mother get her son back in real time. Frank Whitmore was on his feet next, and Daniel almost didn't recognize the sound that came out of him. A rough, broken kind of laugh, mixed with tears. The sound of a 71-year-old deacon who'd spent 30 years thinking he understood a word he'd never fully understood at all. "I've been saying Daddy my whole life," Frank said to no one, and everyone wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. "And calling it faith. But I never once brought him the real stuff. Not really. Not the fear. I just smiled and said the nice version and called it trust." Doris, still in the fourth row, reached over and took the hand of the stranger sitting beside her. Someone she'd never spoken to before that morning, and neither of them let go. Daniel let almost a full minute pass before he spoke again because he knew the way you know these things after enough years in a pulpit that some silences teach more than any sermon ever could. Then he cleared his throat, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "This is the part I need you to take home today," he said, "because it's not enough to just know the definition. A word can sit in your head as information and never once make it down into how you actually pray on a Tuesday night when you can't sleep and you're scared and you don't know if God is even listening." He walked to the front pew and sat down on the edge of it close to the people, no pulpit between them anymore. "I used to think prayer had two settings," he said. "Distant and formal, where you talk to God like he's a judge who might rule against you if you say the wrong thing. Or casual and shallow, where you toss up a quick, 'Thanks for the parking spot, God,' and move on with your day, never really telling him anything that cost you something to say out loud. Both of those are lies about who he is," Daniel said. And Marcus just showed every single one of us the third option standing in the back pew 30 seconds ago. He looked around the room slowly. Abba means you get to bring him the real fear, not the polished version. Not the version you'd say if the pastor was listening, which I know is a strange thing for a pastor to say. The actual fear. "I don't want this diagnosis, Father. I don't want to bury my husband, Father. I don't know how I'm going to pay for this next month, Father." You're allowed to say that. Jesus said that. On his knees hours before the cross, he said, "I don't want this." And in the very same breath, Daniel continued, Abba means you don't stop there. You don't get to use the honesty as an excuse to walk away from trust. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Both halves. Every time. That's not a formula. That's a relationship. Frank was still standing, and he spoke again quieter this time, but the whole church heard it anyway. "Can I try something, Pastor?" Daniel nodded. "Go ahead, Frank." Frank closed his eyes right there in the aisle, hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Abba," he said, and his voice broke on the word itself. "I've been scared for 2 years that Linda's not going to make it through this next surgery, and I've never once told you that out loud because I thought it meant I didn't trust you. I do trust you. I'm also terrified. Both. At the same time. I don't know how to hold both, but I'm done pretending I only feel one." Nobody moved. Nobody said amen too quickly, the way churches sometimes rush past the hard part to get back to comfortable. They just let Frank stand there in his own honest fear in front of everyone, and Daniel realized in that moment that he was witnessing exactly what he'd spent all week trying to explain: a grown man on the edge of losing someone he loved, refusing to shrink the moment down into something smaller and safer than it actually was. Daniel stood up slowly. That, he said, his voice thick, is what Gethsemane sounds like on a Sunday morning in Pennsylvania. That's the prayer, not a nicer version of it. The exact same prayer Jesus prayed coming out of a man who finally has the right word for it. He walked back toward the front, and for the first time all morning, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. So here's the question I asked myself at 1 a.m. at my kitchen table, and it's the same question I'm leaving with you, Daniel said. If Abba was never about making God small enough to feel safe, if it was actually about a God big enough to hold your worst fear and your deepest trust in the very same sentence, then what have you been holding back from him? He let that question sit in the room, unanswered, the way the best questions are supposed to. Maybe it's a diagnosis you haven't said out loud yet. Maybe it's a child you haven't spoken to in years. Maybe it's a fear about how much time you actually have left, and you've been too ashamed to admit that scares you, even after a whole lifetime of faith. Whatever it is. Daniel said, you don't have to clean it up before you bring it to him. You don't have to arrive worthy. Marcus didn't. Frank didn't, not really not until 30 seconds ago. I didn't, standing at my kitchen table Tuesday night furious at myself for teaching something wrong for 15 years. The invitation was never for the people who have it together, he said. It was for exactly the kind of prayer you're too afraid to pray out loud. He picked up his Bible again, and this time when he opened it, his hands weren't shaking anymore. There's one more piece of this word I haven't told you yet, Daniel said. Something Paul wrote that I almost missed, entirely buried in the middle of a sentence about inheritance, and once I saw it, I understood why this word cost Jesus everything to give us. He looked up, and the whole church was still leaning forward, still waiting, still unwilling to let the moment end. But before I get there, Daniel said quietly, I need you to sit with what just happened in this room for one more minute. Because I don't think any of us are leaving today the same way we walked in. Daniel let the sanctuary breathe for one more moment before he opened the Bible again. His voice steadier now, but no less urgent. Romans chapter 8 verse 17, he said. This is the verse I almost skipped over. I've read it 100 times in my life and never once slowed down enough to let it land. He read it slowly, deliberately. And if children, then heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ. He looked up. Heirs, not guests. Not visitors allowed to sit at the edge of the table. Heirs with full inheritance rights, equal standing, nothing held back. Frank, still standing in the aisle, wiped his face again. Full inheritance. He repeated like he needed to say it out loud, to believe it. Even for someone like me, who spent half my life more scared than faithful. Especially for someone like you, Frank, Daniel said. Because in Roman law, an adopted son didn't get a partial share. He didn't get leftovers after the biological children took what they wanted first. The moment the adoption was final, he stood as a full heir, no asterisk, no fine print, no probationary period. Paul knew exactly what he was saying when he chose that word. Doris was still holding the stranger's hand beside her, and she spoke now, her voice thin, but clear enough to carry. 11 years, she said. 11 years since Walter died, and some Sundays I sit in this pew, and I still feel like I'm just visiting, like I'm renting a seat in a family that isn't really mine anymore. The room went quiet again, that same aching quiet from before. Doris, Daniel said gently, that feeling has a name, and it's a lie. It's the same lie Marcus believed for 3 years. It's the same lie Frank carried every time he smiled through his fear instead of bringing it to God honestly. The lie says you have to earn your seat. The truth says the seat was never up for negotiation once the adoption happened. But then Daniel paused, and something shifted in his face, the look of a man about to say something that costs him. There's a second half to that verse, he said quietly. And I need to be honest with you, because this is the part of the sermon I almost cut. He read again. co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. He let that sit. If we share in his sufferings. Frank's face changed. That doesn't sound like good news, Pastor. It didn't to me either at first, Daniel admitted. I wanted the inheritance without that clause. I think we all do. But then I thought about Gethsemane again, the same garden, the same word, the same night, and I realized something that broke me open at my kitchen table Tuesday, sitting there with my coffee gone cold. He looked at Frank directly. The suffering isn't the price of admission. It's not a toll you pay before you're allowed to be family. It's proof you already are. Because a stranger doesn't inherit the family's sorrow. Only a son does. Only a daughter does. When Frank stood in this aisle and told God the truth about how terrified he is for Linda, that wasn't him failing at faith. That was him inheriting exactly what Jesus inherited: permission to bring the real weight of it to a father who doesn't ask you to fake your way through the hardest thing you'll ever carry. Doris's hand tightened around the stranger's. So when I feel like I don't belong, she said slowly, working it out loud. When I feel the ache of 11 years without Walter, that ache isn't proof I've been forgotten. It might be proof I actually belong to a family that grieves things worth grieving. That's it exactly, Doris, Daniel said, and his voice cracked slightly. That's exactly it. He stepped back, looking out over the whole congregation. Now Marcus, still standing with his mother's arm around him, Frank still wet-eyed in the aisle, Doris gripping a stranger's hand like an old friend. I want to try something, Daniel said. I've never done this before in 15 years, and I don't fully know how it's going to go, but I think this word was never meant to just be preached at you. It was meant to be said. He held out both hands, an invitation, not a command. Whatever you're carrying today, whatever fear you've been too proud or too ashamed or too tired to say out loud, I want you to say this word with me. Not because it fixes anything instantly, but because Jesus already proved it's strong enough to hold both your honesty and your trust in the very same breath. Abba, Daniel said. A few voices joined him, hesitant at first. Abba, he said again louder. This time the whole sanctuary answered. 300 voices, cracked and imperfect and completely unrehearsed. Some crying, some barely whispering it. Frank's voice breaking on the second syllable. Marcus saying it clearer than he had the first time. Doris saying it like she was finally allowed to. Father, Daniel finished, and the word rolled through the room like something physical, like a weight being set down after being carried too long. Nobody rushed to end the moment. Nobody reached for their coats. They just sat there in the ringing quiet afterward, 300 people who had walked in that morning believing one thing about God, and were walking out believing something enormous instead. Daniel closed his Bible, and for the first time all morning, his hands were completely still. 15 years, he said. 15 years I taught you a smaller God because a smaller God felt safer to hand out on a Sunday morning. Easier to explain. Easier to swallow. I am sorry for every time I let you believe closeness with the Creator of the universe came at the cost of His majesty, when the truth is, He never once asked you to choose. He looked at Marcus one more time, at Frank, at Doris. You do not have to shrink your fear to be welcomed by Him. You do not have to fake your trust to be safe in His presence. You are not a guest here hoping nobody notices you don't belong. You are an heir, fully adopted, fully loved, permitted this very moment to bring Him everything you are and everything you're afraid of in the very same sentence. He raised the Bible one final time. The Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Not servants standing outside the door. Not strangers hoping to be noticed. Children. Heirs. People who finally have the right word for what they've been trying to say their whole lives. He let the silence hold the room one last time. So the next time fear grips you in the middle of the night, and you don't know if you have the strength to pray one more polished, careful prayer, don't. Just say the one word Jesus said on His knees the night before He died for you. Say it exactly as broken, and exactly as trusting as you actually feel. Abba. Father. That was never a small word. It was never meant to be. It was the most expensive word ever spoken, purchased in a garden, sealed on a cross, and handed to every single one of us as a gift we could never have earned on our own. Daniel closed the Bible, completely held it against his chest, and looked out at his congregation one final time. "Go home today and pray like you actually believe that," he said. "Because you do belong in that room with him. You always did. And nothing you bring him, not your fear, not your failures, not your 11 years of grief, will ever be enough to make him let go of your hand."